Today's round is being played at Knollwood Golf Club, and this is on the old course, and this video is going to show you some of the differences between breaking 90 and breaking 85. Although this opening hole is a drivable par 4, I play it safe with a 5-wood. And I top it. But it's in the middle of the fairway, and a good miss is always better than a bad outcome. Dan also chooses to not use his driver and unfortunately hits his 3-wood off into the right rough, and there is a giant tree right in the way of the green. My approach to the green is wide open, and it is a little bit of a blind shot, but that's not really an excuse for how much I underhit this ball, and it ends up not being able to bounce on, and I have to still chip to try and get close to save a par. And looking back on it now, I shouldn't have used my 56 degree. It's often better to choose a club with less loft and try and bump and run it. And unfortunately, Dan also has a bad chip, because that thing thinned all the way to the other side of the green. So he's leaving himself a long putt to try and get close to save his par. I put a pretty good stroke on my par putt and it just goes a little bit off from the hole. That's an opening bogey for me. And considering I had a bad tee shot and a bad chip, I will take that all day. Dan also taps in his bogey putt and we are both +1 through 1. The second hole is a 145-yard par 3, and I have to take an aggressive line over the trees on the left because I don't feel very comfortable fading my irons. Thankfully I struck this one really well and I'm on the green with a birdie putt. Unfortunately, Dan hits his a little bit fat, so he comes up short of the green, but he has a really nice pitch shot here that lands on the fringe and releases towards the hole, and he's giving himself a really great chance to save the par here.
Did you thin it or did it come up fast?
But it just misses the edge. That's a tap-in bogey. I thought I put a good strike on my birdie putt here, but the greens at Knollwood do run slow, and this one ends about 1.5 feet short, but that's an easy tap-in par, still +1 for me. Third hole is another par 3, and this is a hole that unfortunately always gets in my head. It plays at 200 yards, and it's a very narrow path through those trees. You can tell here that I am not confident with my club selection because I have a 4-iron in my hand, and while I'm over the ball, I'm still trying to visualize what this shot should look like. And as you watch me end up in the water here, it's a good time to remind you that you should visualize your shot before you hit it, and then just hit with confidence. Dan also unfortunately ends up in the water and we both have to take a drop. So here I am taking my third shot, and you're going to notice some differences in the way that Dan and I play golf. I am usually very comfortable with my 60-degree lob wedge, and even though I don't hit this one well, I know that I can make up for it with my next shot. Dan is not as comfortable with his 60-degree, and he absolutely thins this one to the other side of the green. So even though I didn't like my last shot, I just allowed myself to forget about it and try and make this next one really good. And that's my attempt for a bogey, and it actually almost drops. So I just plop on up there, tap it in with my wedge, and that's a double bogey. And unfortunately Dan isn't as comfortable with his recovery here, and he blows this one past the hole as well. So he decides to take the double par, and this will not be the last time Dan picks up his ball without finishing the hole. So let's play a little game called, how many more times will Dan pick up his ball? Why don't you comment below what you think? And if you haven't already, click that subscribe button. It really helps the algorithm. Hole 4 is a really interesting one because it's all about risk-reward. It is possible to drive this green, but it is very narrow up there in order to do so, and I don't feel very confident drawing it in there. So I just decide to use my 5-wood again, and I hit this one a lot better than the first hole, and it ends up in a great spot. This hole shapes up perfectly for Dan's shot because he normally has that big slice. Unfortunately, he gets a little bit thin on this one, so it stays quite low, but he gets a lot of run out of the ball, and it actually ends up going further than mine did. This is another shot that I look back on and think that I should have played it differently. I tried to use my 60-degree and just drop this thing at the hole, but I ended up pushing it a little bit off to the left fringe. Dan's angle of attack is much better as his ball flight comes in low and it just runs up towards the hole, and it gives himself a really good look at birdie here. With how deep I am in the fringe, I used to just chip this, but I'm trying to putt them more because of all the times that I've heard that a miss with a putt is usually better than a miss with a bad chip. And you can see here, I missed this quite a bit, so I'm not sure that really works for me. And Dan must have been inspired by my heavy hands here because his birdie putt hammers through that lip. I missed my par putt here, and this is another disappointing bogey. Just like on the first hole, I can't let this keep happening if I'm in the middle of the fairway less than 150 yards away. Thankfully, Dan taps his par in, so at least the hole was good for one of us. And that brings us to our first par 5 of the day. Now these are holes that I'm not necessarily trying to make birdies on, because I find that if I just play consistent enough, a good par on a par 5 is going to do just as much for my score as getting too aggressive and having it backfire. So I have a nice smooth swing with my driver here, and it is a perfect fade to the middle of the fairway. And although a dogleg left is not ideal for Dan's swing shape, There's actually a lot of room over to the right here, so he takes a nice line down the left side and lets that slice back towards the middle right of the fairway, and you can see that he's right in a nice spot. And even though he takes a conservative play with his iron, he accidentally hits it off to the right side, and he ends up with a really difficult approach into the green. Now, I also make a mistake, as I'm right in the middle of this fairway, but I pull my approach shot, and I'm also tucked behind some trees. And just like that, a relatively straightforward par 5 is becoming quite a bit more challenging. And Dan does the best that he can because of that difficult position, and he ends up pitching it just to the front of the green. You can see here that mine is in a really tricky spot where I have to try and punch it low between these trees. It came out a little hot and I end up on the back side of the green. And just like the last hole, I'm left with putting through a good chunk of fringe here, and it completely played into my mind. I underhit that way too much. Dan does the exact opposite of me, and he absolutely hammers this birdie putt attempt right past the hole. And he leaves himself with a very difficult par putt attempt here because it's slightly downhill and it looks like it breaks quite a bit to the left. So I'm really hoping that you did not tune into this video in hopes of a putting clinic, because neither Dan or I are doing anything of the sort. And you can see that I just missed my par putt and have to tap in for an unfortunate bogey, which Dan tries to match, but unfortunately that bogey putt misses and rolls a little bit past the hole, and there we go. If we're keeping track, he just picks up and takes a double bogey. Hole 6 is a 315-yard par 3 that has lots of room to miss to the right, so I miss a little bit to the left. And with so much room, this sets up very well for Dan's controlled slice, as he sets up to the left and lets that thing bleed off to the right, and he ends up right in the middle of the fairway. And this is one of his nicest shots of the day, as he has a little baby draw up into that elevated green, and he's giving himself a chance for instant redemption with another chance at a birdie putt. I set up for my shot, and just in my backswing, I get attacked by flies. So I decide to reset, and I approach the green from this left rough, and I hit a really good 60-degree wedge. It's a little bit over the pin and went a bit further than I thought it was going to, but I'm on the green and also have a birdie putt. And in one of my most embarrassing moments of the day, you can see that I take a good long time to really read this putt. I'm pacing it out, I'm checking the line, and then I'm realizing I've been lining that up with the wrong ball. Mine is not the one on the left, it's actually on the right. Well, this is awkward. And instead of taking the time to actually line up this putt, I just decide that I probably had a rough look at it because of the other ball, so I give it my best attempt, and the read is actually not that bad. The pacing's a bit off, but it was in my head, and I missed that par putt. Gross bogey. And if you've made it this far in the video to watch Dan and I keep grinding away, here is your reward, as Dan absolutely drains this birdie putt. He gets to flap those wings, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button, show him some respect. That brings us to hole 8, and I'm inspired by Dan's birdie and my disappointment of my bogey, so I decide to absolutely lace this drive, and it is perfectly in the center of the fairway. And it should be no surprise that Dan aims way left, ends up way right, and he is just short of the fairway but has a decent shot. This is a par 5, so for his second attempt he pulls out an iron, but has a little bit of a push on this one, and he ends up in the right rough, but he's still a decent length from the green. He can get there in 3. I decide to go for the green in 2 because I'm just about 200 yards away, and I hit a pretty decent 4-iron. It's a little bit to the right side, but it is up on the hill, so I have a little bit of a chip. Dan's approach in is really nice. He's actually on the green, and he has a 3rd birdie putt in a row. I've got a little bit of green to work with here, and again, I have that 56 degree that I hit a bit too far, and it rolls out more than I anticipated. But I do have a chance for a birdie here. However, you can see it is a big swing, and it's in! I did it! I get to flap my wings immediately after Dan did his. You can see here how good Dan's approach shot was, and he has a great look at birdie, but it comes up just short, so he has a tap-in par. Oh, never mind. That's pickup number 2 if you are keeping track. As we enter hole 8, Dan has a little bit of momentum after good back-to-back holes, but unfortunately he pulls his tee shot a bit to the left, but fortunately he kicks it off of the tree, and it ends up just in the left fairway. And I must have been too excited for my birdie because I forgot to hit record. Thankfully, it was not a good tee shot, and as you can see, I ended up in the left rough here underneath some trees. One of the ways I've been able to play myself to a high single handicap is by doing things like that. Sometimes you have to take your medicine, just punch out, and don't try to be a hero and make every green. So after Dan's second shot just misses left of the green, I have an approach up, and I didn't quite hit this full, so I'm going to have to work hard to try and 2-putt for that bogey. Dan has a little bump and run with his hybrid and leaves himself a little bit short of the hole. Here is my par putt that I actually put great pace, nice line, but that's the kind of bogey I'm okay with, and it keeps the score from blowing up. This is Dan's par putt, and I actually don't know how to say anything about what happens next. The ninth hole is another drivable par 4 on this course, and this time I decide I will bring out the driver. I just use a nice controlled swing here, and it ends up a little bit short to the right, and I have a great chance to pitch on. Dan aims left, goes right, and unfortunately, he loses his ball. There was some really long grass over there, it was a bit wet, and we're not quite sure where it ended up, so he had to take a drop, which means he's hitting his third shot here, and he was a little bit frustrated, and I think that played into him coming up quite short. I follow suit by having a not very good chip here myself, and I'm a little bit frustrated, but thankfully, sometimes the golf gods reward the patient. For the second time in 3 holes, I get to flap my wings. Now unfortunately I missed Dan's chip on here, so this is actually his 5th shot, and his putt goes a little bit to the right, and you guessed it. If you commented a guess for how many more balls will Dan pick up, you might want to comment again and pick a higher number. So that brings us to the 10th hole. I'm sitting at 41 through 9. Dan is at 45. This is a dogleg left par 4, and I actually hit this gentle driver directly on the line that I wanted. It just unfortunately did not fade left for me. Thankfully, because I did not give it full power, it just ended up in the rough and it did not reach those trees. This is not a hole that shapes up well for Dan, but he does a great job here of eliminating his slice completely and hits a dead straight fairway wood straight in the middle of the fairway. I just said fairway twice, and that sounded weird, but I'm just going to keep plowing forward. My approach shot has to go over a couple of trees here and clear a creek to get to the green. So you could see that I was working on a little bit of a left shoulder low move there because I found I have the tendency to stand up through my shots a lot and thin them. It worked out really well here as I cleared the trees no problem and ended up on the back of the green. Dan pulls his shot a little bit here, but you'll notice there's a big ridge on the left side of that green and he actually ends up right on top of it. So this is one heck of a tricky putt. You can see how quick that ball comes down the ramp, and it was really hard for him to get a read on it, but he left it pretty close and has a chance at par. I was fortunate that my ball ended up where it did, because if it rolled a little bit further, I would have been putting out of the fringe again, and we know how poorly that would have gone. Instead, I have decent pace on this putt, and it just ends up bleeding off a little bit to the left of the hole. Dan's par attempt is just on the edge again, and he's got a chance for the bogey putt, which he chooses not to take. And I know I'm having fun with Dan's pickups here, but I think it is important to highlight that one of the keys to getting more confident at being able to break 85 consistently as opposed to breaking 90 is you need to get confident making these shorter putts. Hole 11 is another drivable par 4, but this one has a lot more risk reward. You can see how narrow it is up by the green there, but I decide that I'm going to aim at the trees just to the right and try and let it fade off left, and unfortunately this is another one, just like last hole, it stayed dead straight on my line and I ended up in the front of those trees. And we can see here that Dan's feet are actually lined up in the middle of the fairway. He's not playing for his slice this time, and I think he might have possibly been trying to hit a nice straight shot like he did last hole, but unfortunately his slice has returned and he ends up into the right rough. He has a really nice approach here though, as he lands on the front of the green and it starts to roll up towards the hole and then bleeds a little bit off to the left. I was fortunate to find my ball in this little patch here, and I thought I was going to punch out, but I actually noticed if I could get the ball up relatively quickly, I could go towards the green. Even if I just get anywhere on and have a putt, that would still be better than pitching out to the side and trying to chip it close. So I attempt to go for it here, and it comes out really clean. I bounce off the rough, onto the green, and somehow I have a birdie putt. And although this was a misread where I didn't see the ball moving left at the end there, I had decent pace on it and I leave myself a relatively short tap-in par, and those are 2 hard-fought pars to open up my back 9. And although Dan has a good look at a birdie here, his putting issues do arise again. He leaves that one a little bit long and he actually taps that one in and it goes in. Hole 12 is another par 4 that has an interesting look to it. It's pretty narrow right off the tee box here, but it does shape up well for me. I can aim off to the right and try and let it fade off to the left, but I don't do a very good swing on this one, and it goes way off to the left. There is a line of trees that I was thankful enough to end up on the left side of, so as you see me fight for my life against these branches, I'm actually on the next hole. I'm punching it out to a spot that I think I'll have a good look at the green, and it ends up being in a perfect spot. You can see here there's this little gap, and I'm able to go straight through it towards the green, and I get on. So my goal here is just to 2-putt for bogey, count my blessings, and get the heck out of here. We can now catch up with Dan because you'll notice that I missed a few of his shots as I went on my adventure. This is his 3rd shot as he pitches onto the green and he's a little bit short of the hole. This is now my par putt attempt that I leg right up by that hole and I successfully take my 2-putt for the bogey. which means Dan now has this lengthy par putt attempt, or he can also just play it safe and 2-putt for bogey, but he again burns this one a little bit past the hole. He's got the tap-in chance, and chooses not to take it. That's a bogey? And if you're ever fortunate enough to play the old course at Knollwood Golf Club, you'll notice that there are a lot of drivable par 4s. So this is one that I'm trying to get to with a 5-wood, but I actually just played it a little bit off to the left, so it ends up being short. That's what I would call a good miss, and unfortunately I can't do much with the shot tracer on this one because Dan pulls his straight to a tree and it actually kicks off way to the right here. And you're going to see in this shot he's way back by that mound of sand as he has a long shot for his second, and he ends up just doing a good job finding the fairway, leaving it a bit short. I have a nice little pitch onto the green here, and I think Dan was getting frustrated because he wasn't really waiting for me to catch up to him in time for these shots, so I missed his third shot where he got onto the green, so that was actually his par putt that he missed. This is my birdie that just misses the edge, and I can tap in for a relatively straightforward par, and Dan now has a chance for his bogey putt, which just misses the edge, and he has an unfortunate double bogey. The 14th hole is a par 5, and I'm trying to find that fade again, but you can see it stays right on my line for the third straight time, and it enters into this tree area. I listened to see if it knocked off anything, and it didn't really, and you'll see that it ends up in an okay spot though. Dan did something here that just absolutely skied his shot. So his second is barely past the red tees there, and he ends up in a pretty good spot in the fairway. So after giving a look at my ball, I decide not to play hero, and I just punch it out to the fairway. So this is now my third shot. I'm getting a little bit more aggressive here as I take my 5-wood, and I'm going for the green, even though it's really narrow, and I end up just short left.
Dan hit before I could get there and hit record. It went in the trees.
So that means, unfortunately, this is Dan's 5th shot, but he does hit a good one here, and he gets himself on the green, and there might be a chance to save the bogey after all that adventure. So my hope here with my 4th shot is to put it close enough that I have a really good chance to make a par putt, but I also know that I'm having a relatively decent back 9 so far, so even taking a bogey keeps breaking 80 very much alive for me. Dan pulls his bogey putt a little bit to the left here, and that's going to be a tough double Never mind, he picked it up, so that makes it easier. My par putt comes just short, and I have to tap in for the bogey. I don't love taking bogeys on par 5s, but sometimes you have to acknowledge when they're not so bad. I was in the trees, and I made it work. I follow that up with a really nice tee shot on this short par 3, and I'm not letting that previous hole get in my head. I now have a chance at a birdie. Dan hits a decent shot here, but pulls it a little bit again to the left. And with the pin location today, this is a tricky chip on because there's a big ridge there. And you can see he lands on it and it kicks left instead of towards the hole. Really good weight on it, but it's just the unfortunate nature of where he was. My birdie putt goes up towards the hole and just misses. And you can see I give respect to this par putt because there's a little bit of break on it. So I don't want to take it for granted, and it's in. I'll take that par. Nice bounce back from the par 5. Dan's par attempt just misses the edge. And that's a bogey. Hole 16 is another par 5, and just like the previous one, it's not incredibly challenging, but you do need to be accurate because it is narrow. And unfortunately I top my 5-wood, but it actually ends up in a nice safe spot in the fairway. Dan's shot unfortunately ends up well off to the right here, and he goes through a comedy of errors trying to find his way out. His second shot is flubbed, and you can listen to where his third shot goes. Off a tree, and it comes back. And then for his 4th shot, that is another tree, and these aggressive shots just aren't working for him. But sometimes even playing conservative backfires. As I try to draw this 6-iron into the fairway, you'll notice that I go a little bit left, fades into the trees.
Found it in the tree, had to come out lateral, so that's a drop. Playing 1, 2, 3, hitting 4.
And clearly the amount of effort it took me to count just zapped my brain because I flubbed this shot, and you can see my face. That's going to be tough to even make a bogey now. I missed recording Dan's 5th shot, but he ended up at the back of the green, and I guess he drained a really long bogey putt, so what a save. I'm now trying to pitch it close enough that I can also save a bogey, and these would be 2 very different ways of achieving the same score. That's a pretty decent chip on there, and now I'm getting attacked by bugs. Mother Nature really had it out for me today, but I'm trying to keep my focus and see if I can drain this bogey. And that hole really goes to show you how important it is to keep your ball in play. Even though Dan was having some unfortunate luck with those trees, we ended up with the exact same score, and my hole was a lot cleaner looking than his. But it doesn't matter, there are no pictures on the scorecard, and you can see that we are both attempting this 17th hole, which is a short par 3 again, and neither of us manages to make it on the green. I was short, and Dan was long, and you can see that he pitches his on here and leaves it really short. That's a long par putt. I have a nice pitch on here, also leaving it short, and you can see it move to the right, which was a bit surprising for me. And Dan's par putt just misses. He goes for the tap in bogey, or not. And I have a par putt here that also comes up short. Do I tap my bogey in? I do. There it is. Bogey bogey. We have now made it to the 18th hole. This is a drivable par 4. Again, so I decide let's pull out the driver, and I put a really good swing on it, but unfortunately now that fade shows up and I end up a little bit left of the green. Dan sets up on his aggressive line on the left here, just manages to avoid those trees and sends it all the way to the right side of the fairway. He follows that up with his second shot that I don't know if he thinned it or just had the wrong club, but it goes quite a bit long of the green and it's up in that tree area. You're going to see an incredible shot from him coming down there in just a moment though. My pitch on is a little bit easier attempt than his second shot, so I am on the green and I have a chance at a closing birdie. And here comes Dan out of the trees with a wonderful bump through the rough, down the little hill, and this is just an incredible shot. I know he had a rough round, he was not pleased with a lot of things that happened, but that's a great end to the day, and if he can make that par putt, oh boy, what a finishing hole. I leave my birdie a little short, I tap in for a relatively straightforward par, I end the day at +9. And here's Dan's par attempt, what a save, love to see it. So that means I end the day on an 81 and Dan ends on a 91. But you'll notice on our scorecards we each have some discrepancies. I accidentally have an 82, but it's because I scored myself as a bogey on hole 11 instead of a par, and Dan has an 88, and I think you can figure out why. So the key to breaking 85 today was me having some consistency, and the key to Dan breaking 90 today was lying.